At the outset, good morning to everyone, to my distinguished speakers, my co-chair, and also the attendees of the parallel technical session of ICRAJI 27. And just let me see that this session is of 1.5 hours. And as instructed, both the SOAP lectures will be of half an hour each. And after the lecture, we'll have a discussion, maybe if time permits, though it is given 5 minutes, we can extend it to 5 to 10 minutes. So that will be this thing, and the questions either directly put to the speakers or it is through the chat. I'll request my co-chair to take up those questions, important questions, which can be taken up within the stipulated time. So with that, I welcome the first SOAP lecture speaker, Professor G.L. Sivkumar Babu from ISC Bangalore. And his topic of the talk is on framework for multi-hazard assessment in landslides. As a customary, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Sivkumar Babu, though he needs no introduction. I think that the fraternity of this disaster mitigation or civil engineering, they very well known Professor Sivkumar Babu. Professor Babu did his BTech in civil engineering from Sri Venkateswara University, Tirupati in 1983. Then Masters in Soil Mechanics and Foundation Engineering from Anna University in 1987, and PhD in Geotechnical Engineering from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore in 1991. And after that, he has a lot of work experience, starting his career as an engineer in the International Airports Authority of India, then scientific officer at Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, then scientist in CSIR, Central Road Research Institute, New Delhi, then as an assistant professor, associate professor, and professor in Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, and he is a professor in ISC Bangalore since 2009. And his research interests are risk and reliability applications in geotechnical engineering, geosynthetics and reinforced soil structures, environmental geotechnology, fibers in geotechnical engineering, earthquake geotechnical engineering, geotechnics for disaster mitigation. These are broad research areas, and he has many international awards like John Booker Medal, Excellent Contributions Award from International Association for Computer Methods, Advances in Geomechanics, then Wesley W. Arner Award in 2017 for the paper on risk and reliability analysis, then Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship in 1999-2000, then visiting scholar to Purdue University in USA during 95-96, and he has many best paper awards from national and international at international levels, and he has many assignments in many of the SCI journals, and he has guided 15 PhDs, then many MSc engineering and ME theses, and he has more than 250 SCI publications along with the national and other publications. He has written 4 books, many conference proceedings, and several invited lectures, and he has a huge number of consultancy assignments, and he is president of Indian Geotechnical Society, governor of ASC Board of Governors Region 10, president Indian Section American Society of Civil Engineers, president Southern Region ASCIS American Society for Civil Engineers, executive committee member Indian Geotechnical Society from 2012 to 14 to 16, secretary Karnataka Geotechnical Center, then served as chairman, co-chairman, expert for technical sessions in various international and national gatherings, conferences, and evaluation committees and all. And he is a reviewer to many international journals. To name a few, it is ASC, then Canadian Geotechnical Journal, Geotechnique, Computer Geotechnics, Georisk, engineering structures, and there are many national journals. He is one of the editors or reviewers. So with this brief introduction, I'll once again welcome Professor G.L. Sivkumar Babu to kindly deliver his soap lecture on a very, very demanding topic, that is on multi-hazard framework for multi-hazard assessment in landslides. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, Dr. Professor Kanungo, and I would like to thank the organizers for giving me an opportunity. I'm especially delighted that I'm speaking before two experts in the area, Professor Kanungo and Professor Verma Amit, and Amit Prashant and Professor Amit Verma. So it is a delight. I'm very delighted to talk on this very, very important topic. Even I am learning this. So the topic is on, I think you're able to see this. Is it okay, Doctor? Because framework for multi-hazard assessment in landslides. This is the work of Dr. Pinom Ering, who just joined as a faculty member in IIT Bombay recently. And I would talk about some introduction and then what is the suggested framework. In fact, there are a lot of frameworks available, and I'll try to illustrate with a case study and some conclusions. We know that, when you talk about multi-hazards, we are only used to some landslides and other things. But then, we should understand that particularly in natural hazards, you have from volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and meteorological extremes. And at least we have in volcanic eruptions, you have lava flows, pyroclastic flows, and all of this. In earthquakes, we know because of various reasons like fault ruptures, and then it leads to tsunamis and ground shaking, even liquefaction. And meteorological extremes, we know about winds, strong winds, storms are just flooding, rainfall extremes, temperature extremes. A lot of these, they lead to a lot of problems like forest fires, soil erosion, land. There are a lot of things. So all of them are hazards, but the way that we have been doing is that we try to do one hazard at a time and understand it. Of course, our understanding is also we're trying to work towards certain understanding, but it's not complete in most of the situations. So, but then what is happening in the real nature is that there are multi-hazards. It can be 2 or 3 combined. Say, for example, earthquakes and rainfall, then even, say, for example, given that there is a lot of rainfall in Mumbai, there is a lot of flooding. Then there is a road damage, the risk assessment is different. So we need to understand this role of multi-hazards and the risk that we have. Why the process is also very complex is that the hazard processes are very different. The mechanics associated with them are completely different, like, earthquakes and rainfalls trying to combine and then trying to say what is the risk because of both of these hazards is something complex. Then the models used are quite complex, like, there are a lot of empirical models, a lot of people do it and surveys and all of that. Then the data availability is also extremely different. You see, particularly when now we have a lot of climatic changes. What is that? Is it because of the climate change or is it because of natural phenomenon? We are not able to understand. So there are the variability is a big problem. Variability and associated probabilities of failure. Because we have seen probability of flooding. Like even I think in Himalayas recently we had this flash floods, all of that. Then the vulnerability. How do you assess vulnerability? Actually, what I find very interesting was that the COVID, because of the COVID, the things are so clear now. We didn't know much about COVID about 2 years back or maybe in March, but within maybe less than 14 or 15 months, we are able to understand what's the probability of that, COVID affecting India, and then how many people are exposed to a particular COVID, and if there is a vulnerable population, what is the number of deaths and all of that. But when it comes to these hazards, there is a lot of money involved, a lot of deaths. The understanding is still poor. So I feel that we should understand this thing properly. Otherwise, there is a lot of death of people, a lot of risk, money involved, and I think it is a very serious problem. So the thing, we say that a lot of data is needed. That's in fact true. But then data is there. To some extent, we need to do a lot of efforts. We have a lot of government agencies meant for it. what is it they're doing, at the district level, at the state level or national level? Are we having the data? Even if the data is there, are they sharing it? No. So there are a lot of things. There are also some issues like, are they independent? Are they caused by the same trigger? I will give an example. Are they in chain? So there are some issues that we need to talk about. So, people will say that suddenly, who has a GIS maps or who has some exposure to geographical informations, they come up with a lot of maps, which is quite good because to capture that at different scales, we need them. And so to understand how many people, how much of population is exposed. And we always look at risk, right? So risk is actually, is expressed in terms of the hazard, and then the vulnerability into amount. So for example, even you can talk about risk due to COVID, how many people are exposed to, or how many number of deaths are happening. So we know that the COVID is a hazard, so you don't go out. So that government of India has given so many guidelines. But how many are vulnerable, like people who are going out to stay outside or traveling a lot, or that they're vulnerable? And then the amount, how many people are exposed to that, or what is the loss that in fact it can be expressed as like, if this happens, how much is the cost of hospitalization, or whatever is if you're talking about a landslide, the thing is that, how much is the cost of reconstruction, repair, and all of that. So our objective would be to reduce the risk as low as possible. And that's why we call it as ALARP principle. We call it in everywhere in many countries like Hong Kong and many places. Even in dam analysis, it is there. Risk should be as low as reasonably practicable. ALARP we call it. So when in the context of, so we need to do risk curves we should have. That's what it is. So when you come to the multi-hazards, as I said, there are coupled events, like there is a relationship between them, and then they're triggered by the same event. So for example, an earthquake leading to landslides and liquefaction, like we have seen it in Northeast. There are some people busy with the liquefaction measurement in one corner. Oh, somebody says, no, there is a landslide there, but they don't talk to that, right? So then the second thing, the extreme rainfall causing landslides, debris flows, and flash floods. So all need to be combined. If a government wants to understand what is the consequence of that extreme rainfall, they need to understand it in a systematic way. Then that is type 1. Type 2, one may lead to other, like, see, there is say, for example, we may say that deforestation, like we have seen in most of the places in India, that the deforestation may lead to, sometimes in some places, forest fires, particularly in California and all of that, quite common. And then they may lead to debris flows because there is a lot of loss of vegetation, and even the soil properties, whatever is the reinforcement action that they have, is not there. And so type 3, this is another one. Oh, there's, the time interval is not much, it's like a chain reaction, right? We have seen that, so for example, landslides leading to blocking of rivers, and, the creating flash floods in some other places. It is extremely common in Himalayas. So as I said, we need to understand this hazard, which means that there is the probability of occurrence of a potentially damaging phenomenon, and the vulnerability, the degree of loss resulting from the occurrence of the phenomenon, like I just gave an example of COVID, and then the vulnerable population. So then the objective would be to develop what is called the risk curves. Like, say, for example, you can see that the annual probability of accidents, because every year you have to prepare your budget, right? Annual probability of accidents, or annual probability of failure, anything, whether it of a landslide, or it can be any event, right? So, and then the loss because of that, so you have to plot this storm versus floods. The important thing that we should realize is that the return periods are completely different. Say, for example, the certain rainfalls, they occur 1 in 100, 1 in 50, but whereas earthquake, we take a design. So that depends on the statistics that they have. So we need to have a lot of historical data to understand it. And of course, we have to best fit, or there are a lot of technologies that are available. So this is one important thing. So as I said, this multi-hazard analysis is the implementation of methodologies and approaches aimed at assessing and mapping the potential occurrence of different hazardous events in the region. We are trying to say a particular district, or a particular state. So is it, how do you handle them is something that, as you just mentioned, the concepts, like probabilities are quite important. Like, the probability of a damaging event. So suppose there is a hazard 1 occurs, does it lead to hazard 2? So if they're independent, the probability of damage is a function of the 2 individual damages, probability of, the occurrence of a particular damage and some other damage. It can be something like that. One can, because we need to assess the overall damage, right? That is our important thing. Like whether I can give a lot of examples on this, that, there is a rainfall, but what is the probability of road damage? Like we see in Mumbai, a lot of flooding, even in Bangalore, we see a lot of inconvenience to public, then associated losses. So if you want to understand those things, these are the only ways of understanding. And we can give a lot of examples of storms, floods, and all of this. Storms and earthquakes, they lead to landslides. That's one thing. So in the probability, like I think all the students of engineering, they know at least second year, third year, they will be knowing about all of this. If there is the dependence of events, there is a intersection, right? Intersection that I will demonstrate. The probability of damage is that the event has occurred. Given that event has occurred, what is the probability of loss? How much is the so we want to minimize that. The events do happen in nature. The events do happen, but how best we are ready to counter this issues and minimize the damages is our challenge. So given that there is something that's happening because of natural forces, what's the probability of minimum death? Like we have seen the Orissa, the storms do occur, but the damage is there, but the loss of population is minimum. The storms, because of that periodic storms, Orissa government is able to achieve a very good success there. So that is because of the prediction models that they're using. So what is the problem that we have is that most of the risk assessment is done separately. That is a big problem. In Indian context and many places that, we understand the person working in landslides, he only works on rainfall-induced landslides. Somebody works only on earthquake-induced landslides. They don't, but the same person will not work together. I mean, they may do that, but then our interest is finally, if you want to address the need, we have to really correlate them properly. Why this is important is that the damage, say, for example, a person, I think COVID has given us a lot of examples. The probability of a death in the case of a person who is vulnerable is more than a healthy person or who has taken a vaccine, right? So the thing is that it could lead to a lot of estimation of errors. Like, so that is a big problem. Our estimation of the money involved itself, like, we could not estimate wave 2, right? We thought that it's so that we know that how much problem it had. So it is a classic example of trying to understand the risk assessment. And for efficient risk assessment, you need to really understand multi-hazards. Look, as I said, data requirements are anonymous, contrast with characteristic different hazards, construction, synthesis of potential interactions. Interactions are quite important. Like, how do you minimize? So there are one can think of a level 1 where, based on the case histories of hazards like landslides, earthquakes, flooding, all of that, try to categorize. The government should do it, and the engineering colleges should do it. And nowadays we have IITs, and the CBR must be doing a lot on this. So CBRI. So the thing is that we have to that if you have the data, then you can go for quantitative or qualitative approaches. That's what many people have been doing. But then they should have for little longer scales. Then quantitative are also important. Calibration we should do. Then the hazard interactions we should understand. That's other important complex thing. Level 3, this level 1, level 2, level 3. And then, you must be able to understand the written period of different natural hazards. And then they're all random processes, random processes in time. Like what is a problem in a 15-year written period or 100 written period could be completely different. So these are all, actually, I would be talking more on landslides. I'll just give some examples on that. As I said, the slope stability analysis, I will give first a simple example, then a case study. The slope stability analysis normally considers earthquake and rainfall separately. And in fact, we don't even analyze for rainfall-induced landslides with the proper data. I have seen it in the ministry. I have been telling them, that's not correct. And even we don't teach them properly. And that's, I think, problem lies with us. So the consider, but the important thing is we have to consider the processes rather than a single event to avoid underestimation, as I mentioned, because it is that is important. I'll give you a small example. Okay. So see, this is a slope that we have a 10 meter, the 5 meter slope and all of that, and something like evaluate the landslide risk due to combined effects of earthquake and rainfall. So what I'm trying to evaluate here would be that what's the probability that, given I know that the earthquake has occurred, then what's the probability of the slope failure due to rainfall? I have seen in Sikkim and many, I think Professor Kunanga is here. So many cases we see that there is some earthquake, something else happens, then you can't do anything, and because of the risk is so high. So there is a conditional probability that the probability of slope failure, given that the earthquake has occurred, in fact, is given by the simple statement that this is a simple probabilistic statement that the factor of safety due to rainfall is less than 1, given that it has survived the earthquake. Okay, it has survived the earthquake, right? Because we are not interested in like that's what it says, factor of in the bottom. Let me here. Okay, it has survived the earthquake, but then when rain comes, it fails. It's like, so one can have a simple, based on the probability, one can have a simple expression, and we're trying to look at it. So if you can analyze these sort of cases, like given that a simple slope, so we can do a simple pseudostatic analysis for earthquakes and infiltration analysis we can do. And the important thing is the intensity duration IDF relationship, which we need to borrow from hydrologists. This is a small example I was trying to construct to understand this. What is important is you have to understand, based on the IDF relationship that you have for a given data, you have to find out, if you have 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, these are the intensities, because higher intensities are expected when low, when the return period is quite high, could be. So that's what it is. So then we need to evaluate. So I was trying to apply for a given some soil proper this thing. So what I just want to tell you was that, see, even unfortunately, we think about factor of safety of 1.3 in slope stability and even landslides. Somehow somebody has given, and it is actually wrong. Why I'm asking is that you cannot say that the factor of safety of 1.3 is I mean, they gave the number, but it actually depends on the variability of factor of safety, because again, it is a function of variability in C and phi and all of that. So suppose the variability of C and phi is high in a landslide area, and what is the variation factor of safety if it is 100% or 50%? I want at least 1.5 or 2. I cannot say 1.3. I cannot. That's what I just want to say. Minimum. What is the minimum factor of safety of one should be used? It could be. It depends on input parameters. That's what we do in electronics. Signal to run noise ratio. All of that. So here, an example is that I just try to construct. Depending on the earthquake. Say if an earthquake comes independently or for different return periods, one can construct probability density functions of factor of safety, right? Like 2 years, 5 years, and you can see that the earthquake is here, but then as the rainfall is there, it goes on shifts to this side, and then after 5 years or 10 years, you can see that there's a PDF of the factor of safety. So like that. So so one can even plot some sort of relationship and get that, and then this just to illustrate that what should be here you're able to see that the return period has a significant role to play. And we ideally want say for example, if the PDF is shifting, we want to consider that, and then we need to consider the PDF that is common to both or least affected by both things. Here you can see that because of earthquake, it is one, but then because of rain, there is getting shifted, combined, because I modeled both earthquake and landslide. So that way one can say that then what is the slope angle? Like say for example, in a landslides and all, you must be able to 30 degrees, 40 degrees, you will have some, just to understand how does the slope angle matter? Like that one can say that the slope angles considerably influences, and we know. But then you can identify what should be the probability density function that may be that can be considered. Why I'm telling is that the moment you have a combined probability density function, it's easy to say you plot the cumulative distribution. That's what we do in concrete and all of that. And what's the probability of 95 chances, 5% or something? You can do that. So you can even plot that what should be the slope angle, critical slope angle at which it may happen. It can be more hazardous. Say, for example, in the same area on a 1 kilometer road, the angle of the slope, it's all a debris. We have seen in Himalayas and all. It could be a debris of say 4 or 5 meters, and it varies with along the length, and then but it only fails at some points, not everywhere. So you need to understand this and then put it into a proper thing. This is some example of even seismic effect of the the KH value or whatever, just to construct an example. So what we did was we tried to do for an example in Arunachal. Like as I said, Dr. Pinom is very good in this. She belongs to Arunachal Pradesh, so she was trying to do this. And of course, the Tawang Monastery is very, very popular destination. And whoever goes, it's a very beautiful site. And it had some problems, and so there are a lot of even with some of them they contacted us, and we're trying to understand, at least from research perspective, because it's not easy. So there are a lot of slips, and there is an school is affected, and all of that. So the tale that we did was that using the first important thing is that we should be able to get the relationship between the rainfall and then landslide occurrence. We have what is called flare model, which is quite popular and used in rainfall and all of it. So you have a input rainfall, and I'll just show you. You have a transfer function which will tell you the link between the rainfall and the slope moment. Means slope moment, whether it fails or not. So then there are a lot of transfer functions. I'll just show you that example. So based on that, one can get what is called one can establish critical threshold for rainfall. Like I can give an example here that based on the rainfall data, I will explain further. The 3 incidents of landslides. There is a crane threshold, that's a global threshold that is given. And one can see that the actual threshold that you have for the slide, this is a crane's threshold, which is normally given in textbooks. But if you follow that, you may not predict properly. You can see that this other threshold that we have predicted, that is actually, you need to have this, as I said, the intensity versus duration rainfall data. Then you have to plot the number of instances that we have seen. You have 3 here. So you're able to see that you're able to exactly reasonably match them. So this is what it is. So as I said, the similar thing can be done for earthquakes as well, or for any other hazards, like, try to tweak in this model, because what you need is data. And so there is similar data available, and we try to use the area's intensity, and because it captures the destructive potential of the earthquake better, and there is a correlation between seismic slope stability, liquefaction, all of that. So we got for the given data in Arunachal, some data is there, and we put the data. So we did this, and we got constructed this sort of based on the data. Okay, we constructed this sort of relationship. The rainfall, alpha, the parameters. Actually, we fitted. You have to fit a distribution. In a normal distribution, log normal, and you have a gamma distribution and all of that. So if you put a gamma fit distribution, you have the parameters for that. And so you can. So for earthquakes and landslides, we fitted that distribution. They have some meanings also. And this is some data that earthquakes. So these are all some work that we did, like same thing, I just repeating because I didn't put it in a way that I wanted. So this is what I was just mentioning, that the transfer functions have to be to develop transfer functions and develop those the way that I showed, the thresholds. When is that earthquake or landslide is going to come? You can use this sort of things, and then we should also use them in the actually early warning systems also. So some of these threshold functions will be, that relationship will be quite useful in development of early warning systems as well. So this is the same thing, like I just mentioned. I mean, little jumbling up his slides is there. These are all the different distribute the transfer functions. Like rectangular, like we assume that, then exponential. There are different patterns that we see in nature, and actually all the distributions follow certain natural patterns. And so gamma distribution, as I just mentioned, it has certain parameters and all of that. They will you will get the parameters. Once you get the parameters for any hazard and its written period, you can use that. That's what it is, like the fitting and all that. So this is what we are trying to do here. So a lot of work is there already available on this, and so one can understand from the literature. And the one important thing that we were trying to see is that if you have all the data collected, how do you say that the data is only because of rainfall, or is it only because of earthquake, or is it because of both? Because that's what is multi-hazards, right? Because that we need to come up with some understanding. So this what we did. So we are able to understand that the data, whatever is the landslide that occurred on September is only rainfall. This is rainfall and earthquake, like that. This is based on use of these things. And I was also talking about the interactions. The interaction is that, as I said, when is it going to happen? See, the thing is, if there is a lot of difference between the two events, then they can be considered as independent, right? But if they're very close, then, so for example, based on the data itself, one can look at the data and say that if the data is the time period between the two events is more than 15 days, then it's not. It could be different. But you can say that if it is less than 15 days, like as I said, first earthquake occurs, then rainfall comes. And so if the time interval is shorter, you can say that there is a lot of interaction, because these things are also required. So to understand these things, what we should be doing is that all of these rainfalls and earthquakes. One can model them as a random process, Poisson's process, because if you don't know much information, exponential, Poisson process is okay. That's what we do for earthquake. So we try to set a time and then identify the rainfall events and earthquake events corresponding to the mobility functions, which are greater than the critical value. Then probability of having the landslide triggering and the rainfall and whatever you can calculate. And so all of this, the interest was that this one, right? Based on that, the condition probability, the probability that landslide occurs, or having seen that its earthquake is there, or it survived in 15 days, is this. So then we can construct some relationships and then say that the probability, either PDF and then the exposure time, and say that here, for example, the rainfall, it is like this, and earthquakes, because of the nature, the data that it is like this. But if it is combined, it is somewhat closer to the rainfall itself, which is something else. So if then you can use this sort of probability density functions and the corresponding things to understand what could be the risk and all of that, right? For the multi-hazard, that's what it means. So what I just want to summarize would be that we have to understand the multi-hazards is a complex issue. It can be extended to many hazards, many real-life problems, including the inaction of the government itself, because we have seen for example, you take Mumbai, a lot of flooding every year, but no action. So our interest, as I told, was to reduce the risk. If you don't reduce the risk and if you don't understand the risk, then there is, I think people say that no, government is not acting. But of course, fortunately, that system is not there. You want to raid the infrastructure. That is a way, the hazards do continue to come. So how the governments can implement this is a nice thing. The methods are scalable. You can apply to many things, to anything you can add. Methods is you can understand, and many things. It's just an idea, but there are a lot of things that one can do, and these approaches are very, very much required, particularly when you're handling with disasters. Thank you very much. So
thank you, Professor Babu. This is really a thought-provoking lecture, and exactly taking 30 minutes. That's
Yeah, I can't take risks, sir. I can't take risks. Yeah.
When we have such a distinguished speaker and he has that quality that he'll maintain exactly the time. So that's the I think this is the message for the younger generation. Time is important, so we should stick to the time. And through his this very important lecture, he has identified many pertinent issues like big data involvements in multi-hazard framework or multi-hazard analysis, and then the problem of data availability in Indian scenario, also in global scenario. And he has introduced a multi-hazard concept, and he was absolutely right in saying that we always look to a particular hazard separately rather combining different hazards or interaction between different hazards in having some risk involved in it. And the concept is one hazard leading to the another hazard. Like if there is an earthquake, then there can be co-seismic landslides, then landslides can formulate a landslide dam, then we can expect a flash floods. Due to flash floods, then the connectivity failure, whether it is internet or electricity or transport network. So a gamut of things involved in the process. One triggered, and there are many things triggered, and finally the risk is to the population in terms of connectivity failure and all those things. So people are working, still trying to is basically understanding the process and how to go about it, whether it is the intensity duration, or it is the rainfall events prior to a event, or earthquake event prior to a another event. So antecedent event sort of thing. So there are many things involved in it, but sir has given a thought, a deep thought into the whole process, and open our eyes to look at different angles of natural disasters or different hazards. So thank you very much. I'll expect a few questions from the attendees so that we can take up it.
I'm not seeing any questions yet. But sir, thank you very much for this nice eye-opening lecture. I was thinking of somebody who understands the multidisciplinary research nature of this problem, and you actually hit the eye of the bull. So because I have seen many researchers in landslide who do only one part of the one aspect of the research. For example, if somebody is doing mechanical modeling, he takes all conditions saturated, either fully saturated or unsaturated or dry. But they don't talk about unsaturated condition. This is the main problem with the landslide research in India. And also, and that's why the output of the results have compromised. And people are not taking up the scale of the problem. So they will model 10 meter, but when we actually go to field, it is in kilometers. So that is also create a problem and reduce the understanding of the problem and the output of the results. So I have only, I am just looking at the questions. I don't see any question right now, but I have one question from myself. Sir, you have incorporated earthquake effect and rainfall induced landslide. So is it possible to incorporate other factors like human factors, blasting?
Yes. All. See, it is about conditional probability statement. You have to construct. It is actually, see, you have people are talking about machine learning and all. They're all there. You know, you can just integrate, and it is possible.
Yeah. And how to calibrate your transfer function?
That's what we need the data. See, the thing is, I don't know, like, say, for example, the, data is also there, with the governments, like, on the failures and dams. You have to take those data, like, say, for example, the flooding of a city, Mumbai, or any other town. You can take the data up to what level there is an inconvenience to public and what level, you can always mark those levels. Based on that, you always make it as, in one engineering sense, if somebody is doing well, They let us make it this extreme hazardous. We have seen in Ganges and other places. Also, they try to map it. But what is actually its consequence? It's not understood. Say, for example, what is say if this level of flooding happens, what is the consequence of low-lying areas, problems, infrastructure losses? I mean, there should be then reconstruct. You need to really estimate the risk. Then it is possible. Like that data is available. It's just that the governments people have to be working on those lines, and you can even create some synthetic data to understand the system. We can only, as academicians, we can create some models and understand systems, but it's a system has to respond. Yeah.
And so, do you validated your results in the field?
Yeah. Yes. Say, for example, for the Tawar, the whatever landslide, there are 3 incidences of landslides. But then the data was quite hard. Like in the whole area, see, the thing is, it's not applied to the same place, but we are looking at a particular area. Then we use that number of landslides events and then the rainfall. Like we always, even if we look at in CBRI work earlier, if I know that they were trying to provide empirical relationships for rainfall thresholds. Like if this much of rainfall, this may cause problem. But then you want to handle it scientifically. This is the way. You have already data. I mean, little more understanding, and there are some assumptions, but it's better than using, say, like global models, which are not relevant to Indian conditions. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Actually, it was very close to my heart, so I started asking question.
Please, I'm very happy. Very happy.
Others can ask.
Sir, with your discussion on data, because you are involved in many committees or this thing, let me can we think of a data bank? Now we have departmental wise data bank, like CBRI has its own data, or ISC, or some NDMA or NIDM, whatever it is. Can we think of a national data bank, maybe some portal where everybody can upload the data? Obviously, if they have published using that data, then they can put it in public domain, so that this sort of multi-hazard concept will work in a better way, because
correct.
we can see the data availability and this thing. Now, what is if I am interested in something, I'll ask many organizations if they have data under this thing.
First 2 years of research student is gone in data collection, so that I know.
So if we can think of a national data bank thing, the portal for different disasters or like that, maybe it can be taken care by NDMA or some.
That actually, see, I think you have put it very nicely. I think you are in charge of many things in India. I think the CBRI and Roorkee IIT, they're doing very well. In fact, the earthquake data you are able to store. I mean, I think you have been setting some examples. Maybe Delhi people cannot do much, but at least you can. I think it can be done at least for landslides. You should push a certain maybe parliament bill or something. We don't know. So really, because they said even I don't know about these parliament bills, because they were talking about dam safety. They said the parliament passed a bill, but we don't know what it means as engineers. I don't understand. See, we are also at loss to understand the connection between the real vehicles of policy implementation, and because I think we should really, like people like Roorkee, even many people who have good support, we have to push hard. Because in IISc, we are very far from power centers. So probability of making influence is very low. Yeah.
So I think there is no more questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Again for an eye-opening lecture to all of us. So the organizing committee of ICRAJI is very grateful to you, sir. And I am also very grateful to the organizing committee and for giving such a nice platform to share, to hear also from very distinguished speakers. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much, sir. I could speak to you. I mean, very important, all 4 of you who have a lot of say in most of the things. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Then I think we'll move to the next SOAP lecture by another distinguished professor, Amit Prasant from IIT Gandhinagar. And it's my pleasure to introduce him, though he is very honest in providing few lines about his CV, though he has many more credentials to his credit, but I think because of time constraints, he has provided a very brief CV. He is currently working as a professor in civil engineering at IIT Gandhinagar. He has done his BTech from IIT Roorkee in 97, then PhD from University of Tennessee, USA in 2004. And then he has started his career as an assistant engineer in Consulting Engineering Services India Private Limited, New Delhi, in the way back 97 to 99. Then as a postdoc fellow in University of Tennessee, USA. Then assistant professor in IIT Kanpur from 2005 to 10. Associate professor in IIT Gandhinagar from 2000 to 15. And since 2015, he is professor. And he has also been officiating director of IIT Gandhinagar in the year 2019. And his research interests are constitutive modeling for granular materials, numerical modeling of geotechnical structures, earthquake geotechnical engineering, then applications of geosynthetics. And I know he has many credentials regarding publications in SCI journals or books or name awards. Everything is there in his credits. With this brief biodata, I will not come between the audience and Professor Amit. So I will invite Professor Amit to deliver a lecture on computing seismic displacements of cantilever retaining wall using double wedge model. Thank you, sir. Welcome you, sir.
Thank you so much for your nice words, kind words. It was a pleasure listening to Professor Babu, always it is. And it is going to be a challenge matching the energy that has been already flowing around. So thank you for this opportunity. Of course, this topic was developed and you can say researched by one of my students, recently graduated, Dr. Prajakta Jadhav. And as generally happens is we have all the work done by the students and we tell everybody about it and feel proud of that, whatever has come out of their efforts. So it is work from Dr. Jadhav. So this work we started, sorry, yeah. So the overall idea is that when we talk about seismic design, first step is of course checking the stability and all those aspects, but at the same time, we do allow deformations in the structures so that it don't become uneconomical, heavily uneconomical in that sense. But to allow that, we need to estimate how much deformation is going to happen. And that's where deformation estimation methods have been you can say in development for a long time. But most of the developments that have happened is based on whatever was developed initially for slopes. And we extended those to gravity walls as well as retaining walls later in some approximate manner. But is that sufficient? Not necessarily, right? So that needs to be assessed. And also how we can improve with respect to what is expected in the ground in reality with different seismic events. So that was the overall objective. So I'll talk about briefly how the historical developments have happened briefly, and then mainly talk about the double wedge model that was proposed by Dr. Jadhav. So as we know, I mean, there are so many failures that have happened in the past, and most of the events of failure have occurred because of some major displacements or some kind of, you can say, failures that have caused even other triggered failures around the structure. So the focus here will be on estimating how much damage is acceptable and how we can assess that. So depending on how much we can allow as deformation, we can set with respect to seismic events, how much tolerance we can have with respect to the structure's response. So, and that depends on what is the importance of that structure, and also what is the role or function of that structure. So in that sense, whether we want to have really just life safety to be protected, in that case, we can go for higher displacements. And if you want to make it almost no damage kind of condition, then of course we have to allow only less deformation. So for design purpose, when we start the analysis, first we go to static design, where we talk about the force-based approach, mainly checking against sliding, rotation, all those that we learned in our undergraduate courses. Then when we come to seismic, mainly then we talk about the displacement-based designs. And what is the status of that? That we will see briefly. For force-based design, we have generally used pseudo-static approach, which was proposed almost 70, 80 years back. And that is still in use and very much applicable today. The challenge has been finding the coefficient that I will use for performing the pseudo-static design. So if you look at the figure on the right side, there is a factor KH and KV. That is what just a sec. That is what we have to target if we want to use this method, whether this value of KH is estimated properly or not. So Mononobe-Kobe method is mainly a modification to the Coulomb's method for stability analysis by adding a horizontal acceleration besides the vertical acceleration that you had for gravity. And of course, with that, there will be vertical seismic acceleration KV as can be added as well. So if we have these two accelerations, one in horizontal direction, one in vertical direction, and we can use almost the same method as Coulomb's method for analyzing this. In Coulomb's method, you had all the acceleration acting vertically. In this case, it will be resultant acceleration acting at some angle. And we can assume the reference has rotated and all done. So analysis is almost same. There is no difference as per se. There is another effort that has happened in last 20, 30 years is to have used approach of pseudodynamic kind of formulation. So the difference mainly is in the assumptions that are taken. In pseudostatic approach, we assume everything to be rigid and the formations are just moving along the surface. And while some assumptions are valid here, there are further, you can say, conditions that are applied with respect to how the velocity is going to vary from bottom to top. Seismic forces are going to vary in that sense. And also from the calculations, how we estimate the dynamic component of the earth pressure that will act on the wall. So there is slight difference in terms of how we treat the forces into the wall. As far as displacement and analysis is concerned, it is mainly focused on the more traditional approach of pseudostatic, converting that into what is the estimated displacement of the wall. In this Newmark sliding block analysis that was developed by for slopes initially, we had a lot of work done in last 40, 50 years where we estimated what should be the KH value, which is going to be averaged value for the moving mass. As the earthquake waves move into the soil towards the top of the slope, the peak values of those waves are not going to be happening everywhere in the mass at the same time. So they will be at different times, or we can say the other way, that every point in the moving mass in the slope is going to have different acceleration values at any instant. So in that sense, there is an average sense that you are going to get. And also there is an amplification or de-amplification of the motion that is involved in the process. With that, if I assume what is the KH value that is we are going to use, then I can use calculate the resisting force and driving forces as we do for Coulomb's method, and modify slightly for Mononobe-Wakabe to be applicable. So that is first step. And then what we do is, if we have some representative earthquake motion for that particular site, and that is one of the biggest challenge. What is the representative earthquake motion? So that is another question. But let's say we know what is the representative earthquake motion for a particular site. So from the Mononobe-Wakabe method, considering factor of safety to be 1, I can calculate what should be the KH value that is corresponding to that. And that we call as yield acceleration. So with that yield acceleration, with respect to that, I integrate my acceleration time history to find velocity, and then integrate that further to find displacement. So what you would see here is acceleration time history integrated to velocity time history, with the assumption that the slope is going to move only in one direction, not the reverse direction. And that will be towards downwards. And then velocity time response is, you can say, integrated values are going to be further integrated again to find displacement with time. So this final displacement is your residual displacement that is going to be expected. And the process of evolution of that displacement is the curve that is showing. Based on these analysis and the diversity of earthquakes that can be expected, people have proposed some charts also. So based on 169 different charts, different earthquakes, there is a Franklin and Chang's, you can say, analysis that is available as a chart. And that can be used with the x-axis being n by a, where n is the yield acceleration, which depends on the geometry of the slope. And a is your PGA, peak ground acceleration. And with that, you can estimate how much the displacement is going to be. Then later, it was modified to by Richardson Ems to gravity retaining walls. And basically, the idea is almost same. The only difference here would be the earth pressure that will be acting on the wall. So modified from slope to retaining walls with mainly gravity walls. More or less, the concept is similar, but based on the response and with different earthquake characteristics, they had proposed certain correlation, and the process to find out by iterations how much should be the, either you can find displacement for a given, you can say, peak ground acceleration and the geometry of the structure, or the other way around, you can assume certain acceptable displacement, and for that you can find out what should be the mass, etc.
Yeah, finally.
So that way, it is, you can say, easily extended from slopes concept to gravity wall concept. And then we have another study later by Whitman and Yao, where you can say the Richardson Ems design was further extended by certain assumptions to be relieved for wall and slope.
Okay.
And also incorporated the tilting mechanism into the partly into the system. For tilting mechanism, or you can say rotational stability, we know in static design we talk about overturning, you can say, stability against overturning. And for considering that condition instead of the, you can say, sliding, we can have similar formulation and define the how much rotation, or calculate how much rotation is going to happen. And that formulation was given by Zheng and Steedman. And the pseudodynamic approach, I think Dipankar's work in, you can say, in IIT Bombay, pseudodynamic method was, there is a lot of work he has done on this to find out how we can release some of the assumptions from the pseudo-static approach to find better estimate of the earth pressures. Going beyond that, if we talk about cantilever retaining walls in specific, which are different from the gravity walls. Why so? Because there is a soil in the back of the retaining wall, and that soil is going to have its own failure wedge, while on the other side, there is a soil that may be part of the failure as well. And there is a distress that is possible in this zone as well. And that, whether it needs to be accounted for or not, that is the question. There are several failure modes that we talk about, and we check for one by one in force-based approach in general. When we come to displacement-based approach, then we will be mainly talking about sliding and rotation. So the conventional approach, and that is what many of the codal provisions provide you with as well, is extended Newmark's method, which is to say, I had a wall, I had a seismic event then, and then wall slides on the ground. And we take the representative earthquake motion. With the geometry of the wall known, I know the yield acceleration by performing the Monod-Kobayashi type analysis for factor of safety is equal to 1. And that similar kind of integration, what we did for slope, I can do for the retaining wall as well. The assumption here is instead of slope, there is a kind of representative gravity wall instead of cantilever wall that is in place, and which assumes a vertical, you can say, plane here, virtual vertical plane here. And this whole thing is assumed to be one unit. And that becomes more like a gravity wall. And against that, there is a backfill, and that backfill is going to have failure only. So that is the assumption in most of the codal provisions today. And most of the methods that were available until now, I think, were making such assumptions. But when we had some experimental studies done, we had observed that the failure is not so similar to what we assume in codes in general. So failure is more like this, what you see here, as a V-shaped wedge. And that will have a lot of different kind of energy dissipation in the back of the wall. And also stability force and the force distribution will be very different from what we have assumed according to the, you can say, approximate method, ad hoc method that we had. And there are several studies that are available for this purpose. So based on this, we had come up with this double wedge model instead of single failure wedge model. So this double wedge model is basically it has inner rupture plane towards the backfill, and it has outer rupture plane towards the wall. And that is basically similar to what we saw in experiments. So if you want to formulate that, what will it take to do for stability analysis? We have to make sure that this whole system remains in touch for certain conditions. So if I look at these rupture planes, they cannot penetrate into each other. So they should have velocity compatibility. Velocity has to match, you can say. Acceleration compatibility, because action is equal to reaction. So normal forces have to be equal in that sense. So there is a compatibility conditions that I can apply on each wedge. But at the same time, what I observe is that along the rupture plane, there is a tangential movement that is possible. So if wall is moving away from the backfill, the wedge can move down. So as it moves down, it will be sliding on the inner rupture plane and outer rupture plane. So in the tangential direction, there can be acceleration, there can be a velocity relative to the body next to it. So these are some of the conditions that we use to satisfy and formulate the solution for finding how much will be the yield acceleration or how much will be the sliding. The challenge here is that now it has two bodies moving. One is wall with logged soil mass, that is this part. So there is a soil which is part of the wall itself, but the wedge is not vertical as we had assumed in the codal provisions. But at the same time, there is another mass, this wedge, which is going to move. And as per the codal provisions or the conventional methods, you can say, the whole failure thing is moving together. But in this case, there can be a movement of wall with logged soil mass, which is different from movement of the wedge. And that is what we expect as per the experimental observations or field observations. So if I put together all the mathematics behind it, then what we need to, what we find behind for the variables that are of interest are the KH y double prime, which is horizontal acceleration for yielding in the wall with logged soil mass. Similarly, here for the wedge, I will have KHY prime. So these two accelerations are what we are looking for. Another thing you notice here, when we talk about this, the wedge, which is towards the wall, the rupture plane, which is towards the wall, I will have two possibilities. One, this intersects the top surface, and second possibility is it intersects the wall itself. Now, these two will have slightly different formulation, of course. And if I take care of all the assumptions and also you can say all the static equilibrium conditions, it's a pseudo-static approach. So we will be solving the static equilibrium equations. So if I do that, then of course I can get the final solution, which will provide me KHY prime and KHY double prime. Once I have these two, I understand that at the base, I will have ground motion, and relative to that, the wall with logged soil mass with KHY prime will be moving. And now I can apply the same integration with respect to seismic ground motion as we were doing for Mimart method. The only catch here is now the KHY prime is going to be function of the current acceleration as well, because of the compatibility conditions. And that's where the KHY prime will be varying at each time instant, while the KY in earlier methods was constant. So that's where it becomes an iterative process. And also this failure planes are going to be function of the stability, you can say, as it evolves based on the KH value. So there is an iterative process that we developed through a code, you can say code, and we find the minimum KY for the wall with logged soil mass from that. So in the end, execution is basically that if ground acceleration is more than, less than the dynamic yield acceleration of the wall with logged soil mass, then of course there will be no motion. The wall and the base will be moving together. If it is the other way around, where ground acceleration is more than the dynamic yield acceleration, then there will be some motion that is possible. And if I have velocity, sorry, just a second. Yeah. So velocity of the wall with logged soil mass is equal to velocity of the wedge. So these two blocks are moving together. Then of course the deformation pattern will be different in a way. It will be pure sliding only. Then we compared the model for 4 different case studies, mainly experimental studies basically in the lab. And then we found that most of the cases were predicted pretty well with this slight modification. We also did some finite element modeling and compare the results with respect to that. So for different earthquake motions, how the response is going to be. Now, in this process, we look at the displacement in 4 components. One is delta 1, which is with respect to the free field motion itself, as it happens at the ground. Delta 2 is mainly sliding. Delta 3 is rotational, incorporated in the overall displacement. And delta 4 includes the bending part of the wall height, you can say stem. So delta 2 is what we calculated from the double wedge model. But overall displacement is what we are targeting. So eventually delta 3, which includes rotational, has to be predicted as well. So by performing several analyses for a few earthquake cases, we can find that. So first we validated the FEM model that we developed and then performed the analysis for different foundation conditions. And then we realized that actually, if we mainly focus on the type C soil or type D soil, if soil is very soft, probably we are going to have ground improvement there, or some other arrangement which will provide sufficiently strong foundation. If we have very rock type condition, there is no major difference with respect to C anyway. So in that sense, we focused on normal soil conditions as expected in type C soil. For two different heights, we analyzed, and after the analysis, when we apply the pseudo-static methods, what we find is that there is an interface effect at the base that has to be still taken care of. So for that purpose, we proposed this base friction angle with the friction angle of soil to be varying depending on the displacement that has happened at the interface. That has been found based on several finite element analysis that have been done and corresponding double wedge analysis that were done. So with this kind of interface effect incorporated, the double wedge model predictions improve further, and the comparison is shown here with the FEM model here, double wedge model here, and the difference between those two. And here you can say with incorporating this effect, if we do that, what is the difference? Then we have another case where we apply shear keys as well below the walls. And of course, with shear key, the sliding reduces. And we developed FE model similar to what we had for without shear key. And validated the model with the experimental studies that are available from Ortiz. And in that process, we also looked at what should be the preferred location of the shear key. And to our conclusion, we found that if we provide at the heel end, it is better. In that sense, for seismic event at least, seismic point of view. So that way we analyzed from finite element and found what kind of failure mechanism that can develop below. And for that, we developed the analytical model and extended the double wedge model for that condition with passive resistance being provided in this region here below the wall. And for that, the formulation similar to what we had seen earlier, we could get KHY prime for the wall with log mass, and similar kind of interface effect incorporated for depending on the PGA, the displacement value is going to change, and corresponding to that, the effect of mobilized friction is going to change, you can say. So with that incorporated, we predicted the response, and of course, the overall response was pretty good compared to any method that is available earlier. With that, we correlated for the rotational displacements with around the 144 analysis, FEM analysis compared with you can say the analytical methods, and we proposed residual displacement factors, different displacement factors for finding residual displacement or peak displacement and peak rotational displacement as well, so with and without shear key. So these factors can be directly used to find rotational displacement peak or residual value based on the sliding displacement that we calculate from double wedge model. So that way it becomes a simple analysis once you have sliding displacement in hand based on the, you can say, assumed earthquake motion at a particular site. We can then use that motion to calculate sliding displacement and use these displacement factors to find the overall displacement of the wall. With that, I can also find, based on how much rotational or sliding displacement happened, I can also find how much subsidence will happen at the top of the wall. And that can be a tool to assess how much damage I can expect in the road or anything that I have on the top of the retaining structure. So that we can, in a way, have some confidence in what is the estimated displacement under seismic event and how much damage I can expect out of that. So that is the overall study. I will stop there, and probably if there are a couple of questions, I will be happy to answer.
Thank you, Professor Amit, for such a nice lecture and sharing your in-depth research on this particular aspect in computing the displacements of cantilever retaining wall. And in your lecture, you have explained the classical models, and then slowly developing your own model and methodology on calculating the translational as well as rotational displacement of the cantilever retaining wall, and how to go about the pseudostatic design or force-based design, and then seismic design, which is displacement-based design. Though it is not my core area of research, but I could get a sense that because I come across such type of retaining walls in infrastructural projects many a times, and the type of failure, and how to calculate the displacement, and then considering all those, this how to design a safe structure, I could sense it very nicely. Then over to the co-chairman for taking the question answer session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I am not able to see any questions. I don't think there is any question at this moment. But from curiosity point of view, there was a difference between your the displacement from your double wedge model and finite element model. So how will we justify? Is it large difference was there, or small difference was there?
So there will be always some difference with respect to assumption of rigid block analysis that we do in any analytical model, right? But the difference with respect to the FE model was very small with respect when we used a double wedge approach compared to what we are using today in terms of you can say the assumed virtual surface kind of gravity ball type analysis. So that is only in the sliding part. And then we also have, you can say, uncertainty with respect to earthquake motion. And depending on earthquake motion, the difference is going to vary. I'm just trying to pull up the slide again. Yeah. I think probably you are referring to this page, right?
No, the earlier one.
Earlier one. Okay. Just a second. So this is the first one.
No, there was a table for comparison of displacement from FE model and double wedge model. Some 10 millimeter from your double wedge and 6 millimeter from this one.
Okay, so what happens is when you have very low PGA, right? So any rigid model will not be able to predict that, because when you have very low PGA, it is mainly the you can say rigid part of that rigid plastic model it will capture, right? And when we start having plastic deformations, only then it will start predicting. So when we have very low PGA, the predictions are not expected to be good anyway in that sense. And that is where even at slightly higher PGAs, if I assume this interface effect with an approximation, that improves the results a little bit, you can say. So while in the FE model, the soil is considered nonlinear and it can deform even at small forces in a nonlinear way. So there will be some deformation, finite deformation. In any rigid plastic type analytical model, there will be no deformation, almost zero. Now, for displacement point of view, the unit, the resolution that we are looking for is around 10 mm. It is not really 1 mm kind of thing, right? So if it is, you can say 10 versus 12 mm, I may not care actually, right? But if it is 10 versus 20 mm, I may care as such. So that way it is justifiable that the predictions are okay, not too bad.
So can we use some interface element, and do you think use of this interface element will improve the results?
That is what we did in finite element.
Yeah.
But we need to incorporate that effect in analytical model also, where there are no elements. It's just a simple equilibrium equations, right? So to incorporate that, we propose this factor. So in FEM model, we have interfaces.
I think I have all the questions from myself, and Professor Kanungo, I'm not able to see. Are you able to see any questions?
No, there is no question in the chat box. Yeah, absolutely no questions. So I think I must thank both the distinguished speakers for delivering such a nice talks, and it's quite interesting, and so simply they have explained the thing. So even in the second talk, though I was not a subject expert, I was telling that I could sense and I could correlate it with the real field scenario, what is happening and why this thing is required and very much necessary. So thank you very much once again from my side, as well as from the organizing committee of ICRASI. And I think over to Professor Dinesh, please.
We have come to the end of this morning session, and I take this opportunity to thank the chair, Professor D.P. Kunongos from Central Building Research Institute, and also the co-chair, Dr. Amit Verma, on behalf of the organizing committee. Thank you very much, sir. And I also thank Professor Shivkumar Babu, sir, for giving the first slope lecture. So on behalf of the organizing committee, I thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I also thank Professor Amit Prashant from IIT Gandhinagar for delivering the second SOAP lecture. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Actually, thank you for, I'm very happy to see Amit Prashant, Dinesh.
Yeah, pleasure to see you.
It's nice, all of you. But the terminology of the SOAP lecture, I'm finding it, no? So you can say state of the art in practice and then SOAP lecture or
Yeah, state of the art.
washing machine or the SOAP lecture, I found it too.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you so much.